Hello and welcome to this episode of Happy Baking. If you've followed my work for a while, you'll know I've long been obsessed with one ingredient: corn. In my first book, The Fearless Baker, I was committed to encouraging people to use corn in sweet applications with my recipe for honeyed corn cakes. In my savory baking book, I dedicated multiple pages to covering cornbread because it's impossible for me to pick just one. And in the book on pie, I continued my mission with a pie inspired by my quirky hometown, starring a creamy corn custard filling. But another corn-based recipe from my pie book is my recipe for cornmeal crust. This crust is unique, delicious, and very beginner-friendly. It's a tender crust that has a little bit of texture from the cornmeal. It's versatile and works beautifully for both sweet and savory pies. Best of all, it boasts a beautiful golden color, and due to its texture, it holds its shape very, very well, making it a wonderful option for decor like detailed crimps, cutouts, braids, twists, or ruffles. In this episode, I'll teach you how to make it and demonstrate a number of decor techniques that will dress up any pie. So let's get baking. Now, you may ask yourself, why would you make a cornmeal pie dough? Well, first of all, like I mentioned, this is a very easy pie crust for any level of baker, even beginners, because the fat is incorporated into the flour mixture almost entirely. This mealier texture makes the crust easier to work with, and it's a bit easier generally to determine proper hydration. Now, I know mealy isn't the most appetizing word, but in the case of pie dough, it just means a shorter texture, just typically not as flaky. But that doesn't mean it's not tender or that it's crumbly. It's a very pleasant dough texture that can actually be ideal for certain types of pies, like the baked custard pies we bake a lot in the US during the holiday season. Mealier crusts also have another advantage. The lack of flakiness means that the dough holds its shape so much better in the oven, which is why I especially love this dough for a variety of decorative techniques. Just like all pie dough, the ingredients for this recipe are super simple: all-purpose flour, fine cornmeal, salt, butter, and water. Now, I do call for fine cornmeal, but it is actually possible to make this dough with a medium grind or a coarse ground cornmeal, or even polenta. These crusts will have a little bit more texture because of the coarser grinds, and this also means they may require additional hydration to come together, so just be careful. This dough can be made by hand or in the food processor, and both methods are easy, but of course, the food processor version comes together much more quickly. Whatever method you choose, the goal is really to mix in the butter almost entirely, so there's really no visible pieces of butter in the dough anymore. The moisture in the butter will begin to hydrate this dough as you incorporate it, but cornmeal also can require higher hydration than all-purpose flour. Since this dough is a blend of both, take care to hydrate sufficiently to bring the dough together, but not so much that it becomes sticky. A too dry dough can crack and be a little tough to roll out. All right, to start, I'm going to mix the all-purpose flour, my fine cornmeal, and some fine sea salt together to combine. We're about to use our hands to mix in the butter anyway, so I'll just use my hands for this. Next, I'll add the cold cubed butter. I've got about 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter wide cubes. Just like my regular pie dough, as I drop them in, I want to make sure that no cubes of butter are sticking together, because the goal is to get each piece of butter fully coated in flour and cornmeal mixture. We have to remember that we think of the starch as like a protective coating when we're making pie dough. The fat needs to be protected with its little floury coat at all times. Now I'm gonna start to work the butter into the flour and cornmeal mixture, and I'm gonna do this with my fingertips. If you have hot hands, you can also use a pastry cutter to do this. And like I mentioned, you can use the food processor, which brings it together really quickly. I'm gonna keep going until the fat is really, really worked in, so it's almost not visible anymore. One of the things you'll start to notice as you mix in the butter is that we're mixing it in so fine that the moisture in the butter will actually start to hydrate it. So when I squeeze it in my hands, it's already holding together a little bit. So this is something that I just like to point out, because the bigger the pieces of butter we use, sometimes the more difficult it is to hydrate the dough, but this is gonna come together really quickly as a result of already being kind of halfway dehydrated right now. Now I'm just gonna make a well in the center of the bowl, and I'll start adding the water just a little bit at a time. Make sure your water is nice and cold. Even though we're making a mealy crust, this dough still likes to be cold at every stage of the process. At first, I'm gonna use a tossing motion to bring the mixture together. And then as I start to feel like it feels noticeably moist to my fingertips, I'll start using a kneading motion to help fully bring the dough together. If you knead it a few times and it's not coming together, that means you need a little bit more moisture. Just like all doughs, I don't necessarily want to see any visible dry, crumbly, or floury bits, and I also don't want it to be sticky to the touch at all, which is why I'm gonna do the clean hand test just like I would do for my extra flaky all butter pie dough. I'm just gonna put a clean, dry hand directly onto the dough and pull it off, and nothing should stick to my hand. We're good. Now let's talk about decor. Since this dough particularly excels at holding detail, I want to dive into some decor techniques that can seriously elevate your pies. First up, detailed crimps. A great example of this is my sunflower crimp. This is a standard finger crimp with a little added detail of an impression between each crimp. And I'm a Kansas girl, so I have a thing for sunflowers. We're gonna start by just doing a standard finger crimp all the way around the pie. To do this, I'm using my dominant hand in kind of a V shape to make that outer point, and then I'm using my non-dominant hand to press towards and down towards the pie plate. First pressing towards those fingers, making that outer shape, and then down towards the pie plate. After I've crimped all the way around the pie, I want to go back and sort of do what's known as a double crimp, which is basically just doing the same motion again to define the points of the crimps a little bit more. So I'll just go all the way around, making the edges just a smidge pointier. It's going to bring kind of a more refined look to it. Once I've gone all the way around and I've double crimped the whole thing, I'm gonna take a small offset spatula. You could also do this with the back of a butter knife, not the blade end. I wanna make an impression in between each of the finger crimps. The idea is that these impressions sort of define the area in between and give it more of a petal-like look. It's a really small little thing, and obviously it's easy to do, but it makes a really big difference in the final crimp. Look how cute this crimp is. I'm obsessed with this one. I really think it looks like a sunflower, especially with the golden color of this crust. I'm gonna go ahead and chill it, and then we can do the next technique, which is a molded edge on the crust. This is a newer technique that requires the use of specialized molds to create the decorative edge, but they boast a ton of detail. I'm using something that's sort of made for use with fondant or marzipan, but they actually make ones that are specifically for pie crust edges that you can purchase in some kitchen supply stores. The ones you purchase at some kitchen supply stores are already sort of made to be the width of a pie crust edge. These I'm gonna have to just sort of use at the edge to press in, and I'll have to kind of go all the way around. But if you have some of those fun tools, this is just another great way to use them. To make sure you get good impressions, you can kind of coat them in a little bit of flour before you start, and then you'll just press really firmly into the crust edge and lift up. And I'll just keep going like this all the way around the outer edge of the pie. The one thing that pressing can do is it can push some of the crust out past the edge of the pie pan. Since we don't want the risk of anything melting or drooping down, I usually just use my fingertips to make sure to bring it back in a little bit anywhere that it's gone over the edge. In addition to these techniques, any crimp that you do with this crust is going to end up with a bit more detail than one you make with a flakier crust. So you can try anything you like. Next, let's talk about making an embossed top crust. This is a really fun technique where you can use an embossed rolling pin to impress designs into the pie dough for a pretty stunning visual impact. And while you can do this for the bottom crust, you'll see the impressions at the edge, and the edge can look nice without crimping, sort of like a molded crust. I find it's less noticeable once the pie is filled, so I like, for a little more oomph, to do it as the top crust, and it makes a huge difference. I have a collection of embossed rolling pins, some of which were hand carved for me by somebody that I know. And the nice thing about these is that they have very, very deep impressions, and those are gonna be more likely to stay after baking. A lot of the ones that you purchase in stores are just a little bit less deep, and therefore the impression is a little bit more on the surface only. But this crust really holds a lot of detail, so no matter what kind of embossed pin you're using, it should show up on this crust. In order to get the cleanest impressions, you wanna make sure to flour the surface of the dough well, just so it's not gonna stick into any of the impressions. And you can also sprinkle a good amount of flour onto the pin. This one has deep enough impressions that I have to actually hit it to come out so that there's not flour stuck in. But I wanna make sure that I get everything really nicely coated. And this pin isn't quite wide enough to cover the whole thing, so I'll have to do a few rolls to make a few impressions for the top crust. But since I want the center to look the nicest, I'm gonna start in the center and then I'll continue at the edges. This is so pretty and I can't wait to chill it and bake it up and see how it looks after it comes out of the oven. This episode of Happy Baking is brought to you by Kitchen Mama. It's the holiday season and I have been doing so much happy baking that it's starting to have an impact on my hands and wrists, and I bet some of you happy bakers out there can relate. When Kitchen Mama got in touch about their Mini Plus rechargeable can opener, I was super excited to give it a try. You press this button and it effortlessly opens the can, leaving a smooth, safe edge. Plus, it automatically stops when it's done. Mini Plus is cute, portable, and super easy to use, and it comes with this little USB-C charger to help keep it powered. It comes in your choice of red, white, or teal. The Mini Plus is going to help me power through all my holiday pie baking. Right now, Kitchen Mama is having their biggest sale of the year. In addition to the Mini Plus rechargeable can opener, they offer a variety of other cool and useful kitchen gadgets. Head over to the official Kitchen Mama website now. Click the link in the video description below and get your new can opener now before it's gone. Time to get that pie out of the oven. Thanks so much to Kitchen Mama. Let's get back to baking. Let's talk about cutouts because they can actually be used in several different ways to make really beautiful effects, specifically in the top crust. But the first thing you need to know about cutouts is that you're gonna want to use a cutter that has been well floured, and you're gonna wanna press it down firmly with one smooth motion rather than twisting it. That's gonna get you the cleanest cut. You can also sprinkle a little bit of flour right on the surface of your dough just to make sure that it is super, super clean when you make that cut. First, I wanna talk about cutouts in a top crust. This is a fairly advanced technique, but with a careful hand, you can make cutouts in the rolled out top crust and remove them. This can be done in just a few places, more or less in lieu of cutting vents into the top crust of the pie, or it can be done all over the crust to allow the filling to peek through, almost like a lattice alternative topper. What I like to do to make sure that the cutouts are where I want them is to mark the central portion of the pie crust by gently pressing a pie pan into the crust to give you a circular guideline. I'm gonna use the widest part of the pie pan. I'm just gonna place it on and press just so that I get a little bit of an indentation so I know where that edge is. You don't wanna put too many of the cutouts too close to the edges because that's where you'll be crimping the dough, and that can kind of result in an uneven, messy look. It can also make a spot where the filling could kind of bubble over in an unattractive way. I was thinking today that I might do them just in a little circle around. I'm gonna use this little heart cutter because I've got a cherry pie filling, and then the red of the filling is going to pop through. You can save your other little cutouts when you remove them for other decor. You can add them to the top crust for sort of a three-dimensional effect somewhere else. You can put them around the edges. You could save them and use them on another pie, or you could even just bake them as a little pie crust chef snack, like Now I just need to gently transfer the top crust to the pie. And if this dough is soft at all, this is going to be difficult because it's going to kind of ruin the beautiful shapes that you made. So if needed, you can always roll this out and do the cutting even on a piece of parchment paper and then transfer it to the refrigerator to chill for a while before you put it on the top. But I worked pretty quickly, so mine is still nice and cool. So I'm just gonna gently roll it up onto my rolling pin, being very careful not to elongate my cutouts at all. And then I'll gently drape it over my pie. Okay, all I need to do now is kind of press my top crust and bottom crust together as I would for any double crust pie. Hey, by the way, I have a video about that. You should check it out. Then I'll tuck the edges under, crimp it, and give this a good chill before I bake it. I think I am just gonna use one of my little cutouts in the very center of this pie. I'm just gonna use a little bit of water to attach it. You could also use egg wash just to make sure it was really nicely adhered. This is looking so cute. I'm gonna transfer it to the refrigerator to get a good chill before I bake it, and then we'll talk about our next technique. You can also skip a classic top crust altogether and instead layer pie dough cutouts all over the surface of the filling. There's really no right or wrong way to layer the cutouts, but I typically like to overlap them slightly, working in rows or concentric circles. I also like to brush the cutouts with egg wash before I begin to assemble the pie. This helps ensure more even browning and also less pooling of the egg wash in any empty spaces. And it also helps them stick together a little bit better so that they're not kind of becoming rough in the oven during the bake. When you bake the cutouts directly on the crust, the advantage is it does bake up like a top crust and it sort of slices like one. But for an even cleaner look, sometimes I like to bake the cutouts totally separately and then add them to the finished pie simply by arranging them on top or around the edges. This allows for the most even browning, and it also lets me weed out any not so good pieces before I even arrange them on the pie. I'm using a type of cutter that's even sometimes referred to as like a pie stamp because they are a little bit of a smaller cutter and they have a punch ability where they make a little bit more detail. So in the case of these maple leaves, they sort of create a veining. It's really cool. I also have these in fruit shapes. I have them in snowflakes, and they're really fun to use for small bite-sized cookies as well. So this is a really fun tool to invest in for anything if you like to decorate things, especially cute. And I'll dip this cutter in flour occasionally as I work. And for this kind of cutter, you want to press it down first to get the outer edge cut, and then you want to do the little plunger to make the veining. I'll keep going until I have enough of these to fully cover the pie, but you can also just do partial placement. You can do lines or rows. And I will say that if you want full total coverage, it takes more than you think. So you might want to make an extra batch of cornmeal dough just so you have plenty to work with. One of my preferences for this technique is to actually bake the decorative cutouts separately and then add them to the finished pie simply by arranging them on top or in certain places like around the edge. This allows for more even browning because I just bake them on a baking sheet like this. It also guarantees a really clean look. I'll brush the cutouts with egg wash, which just again is going to be more help for that even browning, and bake them on a baking sheet in a 425 Fahrenheit or 220 Celsius oven until they're browned. The exact amount of time is going to vary depending on the size of the cutouts, but about 8 to 10 minutes, and then you can kind of check them starting around there. If you arrange the cooled cutouts on top of the pie while it's still fairly fresh from the oven, the cutouts will actually sort of adhere to the surface of the pie, which will make them stay in place better when you slice it later. Cutouts are also super adorable as decorative edges or accents on the outer edge of a pie crust. To do this, you want to prepare your cutouts, making sure to use a cutter that is no larger than the rim of the pie plate. If the cutouts hang too far over the edge, they're likely to droop or even fall off when they hit the heat of the oven. Just to prove to you that you don't necessarily have to buy any kind of new tool for this, I'm actually using the bottom of a piping tip, and I found one that was just almost exactly the width of my pie plate. I also do prepare the pie edge just slightly differently. I don't tuck it under at the edge. Instead, I use my scissors to just trim it flush with the edge of the pie plate. That way it doesn't get too thick when I place the cutouts on top. It gives it kind of a nice flat surface to go on. I already started cutting them out because, again, some of these techniques can take a little more pieces than you might expect. The first thing I like to do is go around the outer edge with some egg wash. The most secure way to get these around the outer edge is to overlap them slightly using a little dot of egg wash or water to attach each cutout to the one before as you overlap them. And while I really love this look as kind of a decorative edge, you also can just place these as accents just in some parts of the pie, like little clusters. Sometimes this is cute with those stamp cutters. You can do a little cluster of leaves or a little cluster of cherries. There's a lot of options, but I'm gonna keep building this pie. After I go all the way around the outer edge, I'm gonna give it a good chill before I fill and bake this pie. Next, I want to talk about a technique where strips of pie dough are used to form pretty ruffles at the edge of the pie crust. And I'm going to cut some strips out of an extra piece of cornmeal dough that I have. But this is actually also a great way to use scraps from trimming because you can just trim them to create little lines and then use those to make the ruffles. You do need a decent amount for this effect though, so you may just want to make an extra recipe like I did. You'll want to roll it out to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters thick and then use a pastry wheel, bench knife, or a sharp knife to cut it into strips no wider than the width of the rim of your pie plate. The strips for forming these ruffles can be overlapped to make the effect, so you don't need to worry about the length of them so much. That's one of the reasons why scraps can work really well. And just to make sure the ruffles adhere well, I'll give that rim a brush with egg wash, or you can just use some cool water. I'll just start by pressing one of the ends to the crust, and I'm being a little bit aggressive just so it really adheres to the egg wash. And then I'm gonna let it fold over, and I will keep folding it over onto itself to make the ruffled effect. And as I near the end of the strip, I'll just kind of press that piece down the same way I did with the first. And then my next ruffle can just start right there. And then as you reach the other side, you'll just go ahead and either pinch that crust with your fingers, or you can use a pair of scissors to cut it, and then you'll tuck that end under your very first ruffle that you made. And that will give it the look of a continuous border all the way around the outer edge of the pie. All right, I'm gonna refrigerate this before we bake it. Let's talk about twisted or braided edges. For this technique, strips of pie dough can be twisted or braided to create the decorative edge, sort of in lieu of a crimp. You'll typically need to make an extra recipe of pie dough for this technique to ensure you actually have enough dough to do it. And then you want to roll your dough out on a lightly floured surface to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters thick. And then you can use a pastry wheel or a bench knife or a sharp knife to cut the dough into thin strips. The width of the strips can vary depending on your desired look, but one thing to remember is that since you're using multiple strips to create this effect, you don't want it to be significantly wider than the rim of the pie plate. So you'll see my strips are quite thin because I want to make sure that when I put multiple together, it's not going to drip over the edge. Twists are made with 2 strips, so you can sometimes cut those a bit wider if you want, more like 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters wide. But the strips for braids that use 3 strips, you're going to maybe want to make them more like 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters thick. Once you've twisted or braided the dough, you can also gently roll it on the countertop to create more of a rope look, but I really like to lay them more flat on the surface. If you weave them naturally, they'll sometimes have a little bit of a 3-dimensional effect, but you can also kind of coax them to lay flat as you do it. For added effect, you can use multiple colors of dough, like classic pie dough and cornmeal, or my chocolate dough, and mix different ones in to give a more dynamic look. So first up, let's do a twist. I'm just gonna take 2 of my strips of dough, and I'll sort of press them together at the top, but only lightly, just enough so that I can start the twist, but you'll see why I don't wanna pinch the dough all the way until a little bit later. I'll start just twisting by lifting the dough and kind of coaxing it, like I said. You can make it and let it kind of stand up. I'll keep twisting till I get to the bottom of the dough, and when I reach the end, I'll pinch that really, really well to make sure it's adhered. What always happens with twists or braids is that the second half is a little bit tighter than the first half. So what I like to do is go back to that top half where I didn't pinch the dough very well and give it one more twist just to make sure it looks the same kind of tightness as the entire twist looks. And then I'll pinch the top part really well too. And there we've got a really beautiful twist. Now I'll need multiple to put around the edge of this pie dough, and there's a few different ways you can do it. You can cut very, very long strips and make your twists or your braids and try to wrap fully around the pan. This is very advanced, very unwieldy, and more difficult to do. So I tend to work with just little pieces at a time and either overlap them when I put them on the pie, or you can even use something like cutouts to kind of place to cover any visible seams. Since I've already got one twist, let's go ahead and do a braid next. I'm gonna grab 3 strips of dough, and again, I'll pinch them just slightly together at the top. And you're gonna braid this the same way that you braid hair. So I'm actually gonna do an exaggerated version of that looseness at the top versus the more tight braid at the bottom. One thing that's also really important when you're doing these techniques is to make sure that the dough is really cold, because if you don't, it's more prone to tearing as you work, or even just kind of smushing and becoming not as beautiful. So I did sort of an exaggerated version, but already you can see, look how much tighter the braid is down here than it was up here where I started. So as I get to the end of this braid, I'll go ahead and pinch the dough really, really well to seal. And now I need to go back to the top part and re-braid it just to make sure that it looks the same. There, we've got a beautiful braid, and as you can see, it's a tiny bit wider than our twist just because we used 3 strands. But again, twists and braids look great together or individually. I'm gonna do a couple more twists and a few more braids just so I have enough to fully cover the outside edge of my pie pan. Once again, you can egg wash the outer rim of your pie crust to make sure that the braids are adhered. I've just sort of chosen to overlap my braids where the strands naturally overlap and pinching them a little bit to seal. But if you don't like the look of that imperfect seam, again, you can put some cutouts or something over it to kind of make it extra fancy. All right, into the fridge it goes before it can get baked. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Happy Baking, where I taught you all about my cornmeal crust, plus tons of fun decor techniques to make your pies look extra, extra fancy and spectacular. You can find the recipe for my cornmeal crust linked in the video description below or on my website, erinjeannemcdowell.com. And if this video inspires you to bake, please tag me on social media. I love to see what you're making in your kitchens. You can find me at eMcDowell on Instagram, at Erin Jeanne McDowell on TikTok, and Erin Jeanne McDowell on Facebook. Until next time, wishing you lots of happy pie baking.